Ask about something.
You want to ask about?
I have to get back.
What do you mean by I can start meeting or
transcribe.
What is
unrelated questions.
Did someone monitor the IRC channel for this room? Can our block recording 3, I think.
you ready? Yeah, it seems fine. Just review. Because it uses a lot of processing powers. And this computer is not that monotonic on the board of 20%. We are playing the basic So, okay. Okay, just keep it.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And even the 0%
and then it like eventually gets you all the way.
I can never stay awake. So, sorry for the delay, folks. I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. Thanks for everyone coming to this session. I call it a crash course. It's going to feel like a whirlwind tour. I feel like there's a lot to cover, so I'll do my best. Before I delve into the material, I want to give you a quick sense of what my background is. I spent a lot of years in school, maybe too many. I did my PhD in human-computer interaction, then decided I'd spend even more time in school as a postdoc. But what's most relevant here is that late last year and early this year, I got the opportunity to participate in GNOME's OPW program, which was my first kind of foray, substantial foray into kind of open source software. And that's where I got matched up with Fedora's Hyperkitty project. And I'm sure all of you guys know that project, but if not, it's basically the front end, the web UI for Mailman's kind of mailing list archives. And so that gave me a chance to kind of really get a sense of how UX works and kind of contrast it with my academic experience in terms of what methods I used to use or was using then and what kind of I saw that was in practice and use in the Hyperkitty project. And so I kind of want to reflect on that and maybe also share and use this opportunity to kind of share some methods and hopefully kind of introduce more breadth and say, maybe give you guys a peek of maybe other methods that could be considered in your own projects or in the future. So with that, in terms of similarities, at the core UX is the same at an academic or an open source software. It's a very process-driven area, it comes from the perspective that it's a bottom-up approach, which means that we start by trying to understand the users, and then we build the software from that. And this is in contrast to kind of the top-down approach, where we build software first and then figure out who our target users are based on what we built. And so when I say it's very process-driven, the process essentially is the same too. There's what I would call 4 stages. You start with understanding the user. Based on the insights you gain from there, you generate design solutions. And from there, you prototype based on those solutions. And then you evaluate what you built. And so the question now is, how do you match that up with all the methods that are in this field? And so what I'm going to do in this talk is kind of give you the bird's eye view of those methods and how you can use them, some guidelines to use them. And then I'm going to briefly touch on at the end kind of a more broader scope is how can we improve usability in the FOSS community at large. So again, the 10,000 feet view here. I just started from the alphabet A and kind of went down the letters and kind of just wrote down methods that came to me that are common methods that you'll see in the UX field. And there's a lot more here. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but it kind of gives you a sense that there's a lot out there. And these are just 25 of the, what I consider common methods. And so what's useful when you think about UX methods is to kind of think about them along dimensions. So 2 dimensions that I think are really useful is one is whether a method is qualitative or quantitative. And usually that's looking at questions like, if you're qualitative, asking questions like, why do you do something? How do you do a task? And quantitative is asking questions like, how often do you do something, or how many times do you click on this link? In contrast, the other dimension that we can think about is what you're measuring, what the method is trying to measure. So I kind of think about, on one end you have, it's trying to measure perceived behaviors, and this is kind of based on what users are telling you they do. In contrast to the other end of the dimension, you have the actual behaviors. So these are methods that actually report on what users are really doing. So you actually observe them doing the task. So it's the difference between what users say they do and kind of what they actually do. And so if we look at that list of 25 methods that I had shown earlier, we can kind of plot them on these dimensions. And they kind of fall somewhere in this layout. And there's a lot of text on this slide, but the kind of point of this is to see that there's a lot of coverage on the methods. They cover a lot of the dimensions, and so the next question is, how do you decide which of these methods you start using? And the thing is, you got to realize where in this UX process you are, because these methods map into each of these stages. And so that's the kind of where we're going to start in terms of how to understand which methods we use. So we're going to pretend we're going to start out with the project, and usually start out, again, since we're bottom-up approach, trying to understand the users. So in this kind of stage, the main thing that you should do as kind of the practitioner is really try to empathize with the user. And so to do that, you've got to be very open-minded, very non-judgmental. And your primary task is to explore the domain, explore the task, and understand how the users are doing this. And so what you should do, or your goal is at the end of this stage, is to kind of identify the problems and pain points of the users. And so the key takeaway in this stage is to realize that you are not the users. They tell us this mantra like day in and day out in grad school. And then the notion here is that as developers of a software, you're too entrenched into the process. And so you make assumptions, or you're not as objective as you could be. And there's a lot of things you may overlook that someone with fresh eyes or someone from a totally different background may do differently. And so the key thing to realize is when you're trying to understand the users, you're not trying to understand yourself. You're trying to understand the user. The other thing to realize in this stage is that context is key. This is especially true when you're trying to understand other people, because you don't want to make assumptions about what they may believe or what they may think is going on behind the scenes. And so it's very important that when you watch someone, or you observe someone, or you're talking to someone, is to establish what are the circumstances behind their answers, or what are the circumstances behind the observations that you're seeing. So the reason that context, as you understand this, is that you can then use that information to kind of clarify any perceptions or any motivations or any decision-making processes that the user has. And you can use all that data later in the UX process to kind of inform your design solution. So, so it's really critical at this time to capture all that context information. The thing is, these are the methods that you could use in the understanding the user kind of phase. And the thing is, these different methods will capture different amounts of different types of context. So you got to consider that as you're choosing which method you want to use. So for example, let's look at contextual inquiry. Let's say you want to try that method as you wanted to understand your users. So one example of doing contextual inquiry is when you don't have a lot of domain expertise. So let's say you decided for this project you need to build software for people who work in airplane factories. You don't have a lot of expertise in this, I don't have a lot of expertise in this. And so what you do is we borrow from the field of anthropology, where they do ethnography, they spend months on end kind of really observing the people in their element. But in UX design, since we're building software, time moves a lot faster. We don't have time to kind of spend months on end. So contextual inquiry is based on ethnography, where you observe kind of workers or users, target users in their environment. But then as you observe, you can ask questions along the way. So it's kind of like a facilitated ethnography, if you will. So it can move along the process slightly quicker. So in contrast, let's say you don't have the resources to do kind of contextual inquiry. You have to follow someone around all day. You have to go to the site. And so that might be not practical for your project. So another kind of alternative is diary studies. And so what that means is it's a paper kind of tool that you use, you give people, so this is what was used in one of the studies out of University of Toronto. So they wanted to look at what kind of information people access when they're on the move. So they call this kind of mobile information finding needs. So there's this book that's kind of handheld book that has sheets of papers like this, and it's meant to be used like whenever a person wants to look up information, they fill out one of these sheets. So they got to be very quick, very short, kind of survey questions that people can just jot down as it comes up. But of course, there's kind of shortcomings to the diary study. You're kind of relying on the user to kind of self-report, and they don't often do it in the moment because they're so busy, especially for the mobile information needs because they're on the move, right? So another kind of often used tactic is to just interview users. So you get one-on-one interviews where you bring the user to a lab setting or whatnot, or maybe you go to them. There are different styles of interviews, but this one I'm going to mention non-directed interview styles. So there are other names that this style goes by. Some people refer to it as semi-structured interviews, but essentially what it is you have kind of questions that you want to touch upon, but the reason why it's called non-directed is you don't necessarily cover all those questions because you keep it conversational in nature. So if the interviewee keeps talking about a particular topic, you may end up a little off script, and so you won't touch upon all your questions, but at the very least you'll delve deeper into kind of the context of their answers. So it won't be a total loss, but it's kind of non-directed in that sense. So in leading these styles of interviews, there's a lot of kind of gotcha points that you kind of need to be aware of. So one thing is you have to have the same terms. A lot of times when you talk about potential features that you want to design for, there's different kind of terminology, especially if you're coming from different backgrounds. So you should always establish those terms, and if you can, use kind of the interviewee's definitions. You shouldn't force opinions, like asking if they would like a certain feature or would not like a certain feature. It's often if you force someone to have an opinion, they'll choose something to tell you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how they actually feel about a certain topic. So. So here's kind of an example of maybe a bad way to ask a question is that you could say, is this a useful feature? And a better way would be to kind of ground it in not is this a yes or no, is it useful or not, to force an opinion, but ask how would you use feature X in your work? So now it's grounded in terms of their work, and it's not a question of would you or would you not use it, but how would you use it? So it's, again, a more contextual question. So another thing you should do in these interviews is make sure you avoid abstractions, and instead of abstraction, you should kind of focus on the actual experience of the interviewee. So again, some examples. Say you're building some fitness app. Questions that have terms like usually is already a bad sign. So a bad question would be, how often do you usually go to the gym? Someone might say, 2 to 4 times a week. And then a better question would be like, tell me about the last time you went to the gym, which might be like, last month or something. So it kind of, with the way you frame questions, although they're essentially trying to get to the same issue, but the way you phrase it can impact the kind of answer you get. So these are all things you should consider. And again, because of the non-directed nature, that you should realize no two interviews will be alike, even though you kind of start out with the same script of questions you uncover. But that's, again, not a bad thing necessarily. So I've thrown in some other kind of interesting alternatives you can consider. One is simulation exercises. So these are kind of things you should consider when maybe it's really hard to maybe recruit a specific user. So this is a suit made by the MIT Media Lab. They call it the Age Gang Now Empathy System. So Agnes. So basically, people can put on these suits, helmet, and there's a back brace, there's a neck brace, there's knee pads, joint kind of pads, and gloves, and this simulate kind of elderly, specifically a 74-year-old elderly person. Right? And so their task was to use this suit and kind of go to the grocery store and perform common tasks like choosing items off the shelf and checking out, but to kind of simulate the experience as if they were a 74-year-old elderly person. And so these are kind of ways to kind of think outside the box about how, if you have to find a user with specific kind of traits, and it's very hard to find that user, very hard to interview them for whatever reason, is there some way that you can simulate the traits that they have and kind of walk in their shoes in some way? So that kind of gives you a sense of ways that you could understand a user. So taking those insights that you gather then, the next step would be to design, generate design solutions. So when we talk about designing the interface, it's important to realize that we're not just talking about surface design solutions in terms of what you see on an interface. It's also very important how kind of things flow. So the interaction design, the interaction flows are other words that you might hear. And then when you're thinking about interaction flows, there are kind of two key things that I like to tell people is make it really easy to do the right thing. And the corollary, which we'll see a couple slides later, is make it really hard to do the wrong thing. So the challenges here is that what's the right thing? And so hopefully in the previous stage when you were trying to understand your user, you already got a sense of what things they value. Maybe they value efficiency, or maybe they value some kind of personalization in their interface, you know. So whatever they value is something that you should facilitate in your interaction design. So, so again, as I mentioned, make it really hard to do the wrong thing. And again, the wrong thing is going to depend on it's domain specific, right? But the key thing is here, here's a kind of fun example. So on Reddit, there's this picture that someone had bought a keyboard and they had a power buttons right next to the delete and cursor keys. So this is power suspend, and you know. So this is a bad place, and hibernate, I think. So these are a bad place to put these kind of power keys next to such frequently used keys. And then this is kind of a bad example of making it really easy to do the wrong thing, right? And so the idea is that if you do have to do that for whatever reason, there should be ways to kind of gracefully roll back. In terms of turning those power buttons, it's not, once you start the execution, it just kind of has to finish, right? So that's not a great example, but it's kind of illustrates the point that you got to be aware of these kinds of issues when you're designing the interaction flows. Another thing you have to be aware of is consistency, and it's a challenge, I think, because for an example, in Hyperkitty, what we wanted to do in the next version is really focus on responsive design and making it work across different screen sizes. So when you talk about different screen sizes, particularly small screen sizes, you're introducing a lot more constraints. And so with constraints, it means you show different things. So we can see, like, if we look at the filters, on the largest screen, all the filters are in a sidebar. But on a slightly smaller screen, like a tablet-sized screen, they become a different filters. They show up on the upper right-hand side. And then on the small kind of phone-sized screens, we see that they collapse into a drop-down where it's now like a sort by widget. So here we see that the same function is kind of not consistently shown across the screens. This was a design decision in terms of how we can kind of present these options in a non-cluttered sense. And so whether this inconsistency is going to bother users is something that we should test. But making these design decisions in terms of constraints versus consistency is kind of a challenge that you'll need to address likely in your own projects. Another kind of issue we have is for consistency is here. We have the large screen. There's a lot of sections. There's the active posts, active discussions. There's a sidebar. And then when we collapse it to phones, you have all these sections of information. How do we collapse them? We now have panels or tabs, and then this month list gets down into a drop-down. So again, it's not the same layout, and so it's slightly not as consistent. And again, we'll have to test if this is bothersome to users. But it's an example, yet another example of how you have to do these trade-offs. And so what are some ways that, like, if you're having trouble making these trade-offs and deciding which way should I go, one way to help you think about them are these methods. And so I'll talk about personas as one of them. Personas are basically profiles of people that you can use to reference while you're kind of generating your design solutions. So a key thing to realize about personas is it's not a hypothetical person. It's actually very much rooted in the data you gathered in the first phase when you're trying to understand your users. So what usually happens when you're creating a persona is you look at the data you collected for the understanding the user part, kind of see the similar traits that kind of span across multiple users and group them together. And so usually a persona kind of embodies more than one user that you interviewed or talked to during that first phase. And you should kind of give a very holistic sense of the users. Not only their background and motivations, their skills, and even things like their personalities, but also kind of capture what a typical day is like for them, struggles they may have, and what things they may enjoy or find satisfaction in. So all these kind of peripheral things that are, again, to provide context to what kind of person this is. And this is kind of to help people kind of reference the personas and saying, okay, I have to make this design trade-off. Which one do I think this persona would probably prefer. And all that contextual information can help you make that decision. So once you've generated a lot of design solutions and kind of culled them down to maybe the best ones, the next kind of part is kind of to build the prototype. So from a developer's perspective, sometimes it's, you've seen all these design solutions and maybe you're really excited to just jump right in and build the fully functional version of it, or as functional as possible. But from a UX perspective, what we're actually looking for is how can we build and test fast? And so this doesn't mean we have to build something that's really fancy, but how can we best build and test cheap prototypes first? And so what do I mean by cheap prototypes? These typically aren't fully functional. They're meant to be kind of rough and dirty kind of sketches or outlines of what the fully functional product is supposed to look like. But the purpose of the cheap prototypes is to kind of identify bugs earlier than later, and so that if something doesn't work, you fail fast. And so you can then focus on other design solutions and move on to maybe better options on the table. So what are some kind of the examples of cheap prototypes? Well, the one I've often used is kind of is one called paper prototypes, and it is exactly how it sounds. We're going to use actual pen and paper to do the cheap prototypes. And so you can actually do them for any screen size. This is showing how you can do them for mobile devices, but for some of them you actually stick paper on a physical, like an actual phone. Otherwise you can cut out stencils of phones and just use those. And you can see very clearly that these are not precise, not meant to be precise, and it's drawn with a pen. And the idea is trying to generate these very quickly and get them out in front of users and get feedback as soon as possible. Will this work? There was a video, but yeah, maybe I'll skip. Okay. Yes, so the pros and cons of paper prototyping. So what paper prototyping is good for is identifying kind of navigation or flow issues. And these are kind of the interaction flows that we were mentioning before. It's also good for kind of getting a very quick sense of whether your concept is on the right track or not. And so this is particularly useful if perhaps you've got a kind of a new version of a product that's kind of very different looking, and you want to get a quick sense of, is this going to like frighten users away, or are they going to embrace the change? And so what's really nice about paper prototypes too is it's kind of very approachable for users, but also for kind of any kind of stakeholder. So not just developer and designers, but anyone, like marketing people or whatever, if they want to jump in and try their hand at this. But what's also really nice about paper prototyping is once you get them in front of the user is that they're often encouraged, because they see something that's kind of sketched out, kind of a little rough looking, is that they'll go in and draw what they think should be on the screen if they think that something should be changed. And so this concept is actually called participatory design. So we're getting the user to kind of participate, to join in the process of creating new design solutions. And so you're kind of getting two methods in one for free often when you do the paper prototyping with users. Of course, the downside, every method has a downside. And for paper prototyping, the downside is that you can't really test small changes, because every time you change screens, you're actually like physically putting another paper on, or if you have a pop-up window, you're placing the paper onto the screen. So it's very deliberate. You can't really test small changes because it's so obvious that you've changed something, right? And it's also the case that because there's so much motion going on in the switching of screens, is that users tend to be very deliberate when they say, okay, I'm going to click this button, and they wait for the next screen, for you to place the next screen. Because it's so deliberate, they often don't kind of randomly click on the screen as they would say if you saw them in the wild, like looking at your prototype. So take that into consideration when you kind of look at your the results from paper prototyping. Another kind of interesting thing you can try is bodystorming. So this is the idea. I throw this out there because I think it's very interesting. So this is Jeff Hawkins, the guy who invented Palm Pilot. And so before he actually had this product in hand, he wanted to test out the concept of whether it'd be used for or not, right? So So back then, having this personal device was very new. This is nowadays not groundbreaking. But back then, somewhat groundbreaking. So what he did is he carried around a piece of wood about palm size and stuck Post-it notes on it, and that was his Palm Pilot. And the issue was to see kind of like what kinds of things would he jot down on the Post-it, would he want to keep those Post-its, and so that kind of helped them kind of look at whether having a personal device was useful, what kind of applications would I want to write on that personal device that I carried around. And so again, this is a very, very rough and dirty approximation to the real thing. But he wanted to get a sense of, would this be a useful thing or not? And so he did this, and a couple of people in his company did this as well. So it's an alternative to consider if you're starting a project that's maybe a little too much on the groundbreaking edge of things. How do you solicit feedback from users? So those two are very kind of low fidelity prototyping because they're very very quick and dirty approximations of the actual product. Another step above is what we call wireframing. This is slightly, it's often digital, and so you get, what's not so good about kind of wireframing is that there's not a lot of open source prototyping tools for wireframing. One example of one is the Firefox add-on called Pencil. So it can do kind of lower fidelity wireframing to higher fidelity wireframes, but other alternatives, if you don't want to do the Firefox add-in, is there's a web version of Bodystorming that's free, or you can do the old school way, which is just using the drawing tools like GIMP or Inkscape and using that to kind of digitally draw out your wireframes. So basically this is one step up from the pen and paper where you're using kind of digital versions of it. But the key thing to kind of notice is that, to not shy away from using pencil and paper. I think we're in the digital age, very squarely in it, but pen and paper, not such a bad thing. So once you've gotten all these prototypes, whether it be kind of lower fidelity or higher fidelity, the key thing you want is to get feedback from users, evaluate them. So now there are lots of ways you can conduct evaluations. The ones that are in my list, I've highlighted here. I'm going to talk about heuristic evaluations because I haven't seen it used much, but I think it's useful. Why is it useful is that it's very cheap to do because it's only done one or two people. One person is, you can discover a lot of usability bugs with just one person if need be. It's a very fast evaluation and it's very effective. So this is usually also called sometimes expert review, and the reason is it's usually done by someone who is an expert in usability issues. And so the thing is, it's very simple. You're given a list of guidelines or heuristics, and you're just going very systematically through the interface and the interaction flow and seeing whether it abides by these guidelines, right? There's this guy called Jacob Nielsen. He, in the 1990s, created a list of 10 heuristics, and these heuristics have stayed relevant for more or less, and relevant throughout kind of the ages. And so you can use those heuristics, and many people do, or often they'll modify them as we're going to consider things like responsive sites and whatnot. Nielsen doesn't really span well to that kind of area. But so basically, but the idea is the same, is you have this list of guidelines that you're following. In contrast to that, which is done by an expert, the maybe more common example is to use a lab study. And so these usability lab studies are probably what you see done a lot and when you have some piece of software that you want to test and get feedback on. Usability studies in the lab means someone's going to come to you, users are going to come to you. So depending on your resources, it's often case a small sample size. And so the key thing to note here is that you want to be careful about how you extrapolate any findings you get from this kind of study. But we'll talk about, another thing you should also carefully consider is how you craft your questions. You really want to ask questions in the lab study that will go back and inform your designs. So you want to not just pick, do you like this product or not? Because whether they say yes or no, how does that going to go back and how are you going to improve your design solutions? And so you want to craft them in a way that it's meaningful for you as a developer. So I'm going to talk about Hyperkitties, how they did the lab study. So in Libre earlier this year, there is a Spinachon, which is basically, the plan works is that you have spinach between your teeth, and so you need users to kind of tell you where the spinach in the software is, basically. And so this is the first time they've kind of done it, I think, or the Spinachon. So there were several projects there. Hyperkitty was one of them, and so this was the task list we gave to the users who came in to the Spinachon to test out the new kind of front end interface. And so you can look at this task list and see it's very much a functional list. And these are all testing features that are new in the new front end versus the old front end. So for example, if you look at the first task where it's like looking for high traffic mailing lists. I don't know if you remember from the front end, for the screenshots before, but there are graphs that were on the mailing list. And so it's kind of introducing and testing whether users are going to reference those graphs when they're trying to pick out what's a high traffic list or what's not a high traffic list. And so again, a lot of these tasks are very functional in nature and testing specific features that we wanted feedback on. So again, carefully crafting your questions so they're actually meaningful to your designs. So that's a quick overview of the UX process in these 4 stages. To recap the kind of highlights in each of these stages, when you're trying to understand the users, you really want to realize you're not the user, so we're not trying to better understand yourself. You want to make sure you capture context as much as you can. In the design phase, you want to make it easy to do the right things, make it hard to do the wrong things. When you're building stuff, consider doing cheap prototypes first, and so that you can get feedback as quickly as possible. And then when you evaluate, always keep in mind ways that you can solicit feedback that are most meaningful, that you can bring back to the table in terms of how you're going to improve your software. And so after you do all those steps, you know what's next. And so the realization is that there's always a better design. And so it's kind of like the life never ends. And so oftentimes you'll think you've reached kind of the local maximum and the best design you can. And that may have been the case for the front end maybe when it first came out several years ago, 1990s. And so maybe then it was local maximum, but clearly not so much now. And so I'd like to think that maybe the new version of Hyperkitty is kind of this other local maximum. And who knows, maybe 5 years later there might be another local maximum that we need to shift to. And so kind of realizing when you need to make that big pivot into a new design is also something that as kind of UX designers you have to be on the lookout for, and always keeping kind of in touch with what users are expecting in terms of their software. So, but on a more broader scale, I also wanted to mention how we can improve UX in the FOSS community at large. And so I thought this is an interesting quote. It's SIGCHI is one of the main conferences for folks, academics, in human-computer interaction. And so this is a 2010 paper at that conference on the practices of usability in the FOSS community. And so what they say at the end of their paper is one of the ways that the FOSS community can maybe improve its practices is simply for it to be more aware of what others are doing to improve software usability. One way to accomplish this goal is to create a catalog of techniques that help improve usability, along with instructions on how to get the most benefit from them. And so I think it's good advice. I think reflecting on the Hyperkitty team, there's Maureen, who's the main interaction designer. So she's done really good, or I feel that she's done a good job in terms of using her blog to kind of document her process and to use that blog as kind of a way to solicit feedback from people in the community. It's kind of, it's not, my feeling is that it's not as systematic as it could be across different projects. And so it's kind of a practice that she does, but I'd kind of like it maybe to see it standardized or generalized across the community in a way that could be useful to other people in other projects, especially those who aren't maybe, so clearly she's an interaction designer, but is it written in such a way that it's useful to other people who are not interaction designers, and can they use that, is it useful to them so that they can pick up what she does and use it in their own projects? And so that's the kind of questions about what we can do. And so reflecting back on the Hyperkitty's UX process across all stages, in terms of understanding the users, what she did, Maureen, is she started off with sketches, very high fidelity sketches of new features. And this is kind of when, the only thing out there was the very old version of Mailman. And so she threw that out there and got a lot of good feedback. And then that was her way of kind of using the blog to kind of solicit feedback and understanding the people who are using Mailman. Would this new version of Mailman be interesting to them? And so based on that feedback, she kind of started generating a lot more design solutions. She started off with a lot of hand sketches that you can see at the top. Then she worked on interaction flows, which is that middle screen you see there. And then we started going to high fidelity kind of prototypes, where we're using things like Inkscape to kind of generate the wireframes. And so based on that, we had enough kind of designs to kind of build a prototype. And this is where we started doing the responsive versions of the front end. And then we did the Spinachon as a way to evaluate some of the front end changes that we were proposing. And so this is kind of the UX process we did, but certainly there are techniques we didn't use in this process, and even in the techniques we did use, maybe there are ways that we can improve them. And so these are all things that being able to critique other people's UX processes and understand like what they did well and what they didn't do well is also something that I don't see in the FOSS community. In academia, what happens is that you get a lot of critiques when you submit your paper, and you get a lot of reviewers telling you did X, Y, Z not incorrectly, or you overlooked this assumption or whatnot. And so this kind of critique is, I think, very useful in terms of improving your processes and making the outcome better, hopefully. And so seeing that, I think, would be a positive change. And of course, maybe there are other ways that we can also improve usability for the community at large. So I'd be open to suggestions about that too. So yes, that wraps up the talk. I'll take questions that come if you have any.
Can you recommend any further reading that elaborates on the UX methods that were on that two-dimensional chart?
Oh, at the beginning, there are some very, very thick books. I don't know if you. They're more like encyclopedia in nature.
Okay.
But I can send you links to that. They're like handbook style.
I see.
So I don't know if you read them from front to back, but you could certainly look up.
Maybe it'd be good to reference.
Yeah.
Okay.
You could certainly look up methods.
Just,
Yeah.
Potentially, have you read Lean UX?
Yeah.
Because that might be a way to get started.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like
So
a
a lot
little
of the-
simpler than the
The encyclopedia version. Yeah. So Lean UX is basically it's looking at the methods, but picking out the ones that can be done very quickly and cheaply, so you can get the results as soon as possible. So, yeah. Other questions?
You mentioned what the developers can do, what the designers can do. I would be interested what the users can do, or what the community can do, and if there is any tooling that the community can use to provide feedback.
I think the challenge, I agree, it would be great if there is a way to get feedback from users. Because I think even in running any kind of studies, whether it's in open source community or in academia, it's really hard to find users. Unless you have this very general purpose, like Google webpage that absolutely anyone can test for you. But if you have some specific software with specific users that you need, it's often hard to kind of find them and recruit them and get them long enough so that you can have their attention for multiple kind of sessions. And so, and I think the question is scalability. Like once we start introducing, say if there's some platform we were to build that would allow us to capture this feedback, we need it done in a way that can scale in a meaningful way. And I think that's the challenge, because there's a lot of these methods that are meant to be like 8 to 10 people, and then there's other methods that are meant to be like hundreds, like surveys and stuff, hundreds, thousands of users. And so understanding which ones are useful to get feedback from users and which ones are not is going to be important to consider. But I like it. I like where you're going with that.
So is there some plan for this like survey approach, like to uncover like some of the weak areas or uncover some applications or like the pieces we have which really work well and serve as inspiration for the others?
I mean, the survey tools that I know about are very good at abstracting the results so that if you have thousands and thousands of users, you get a very quantitative summary of the results. But again, the bad thing about the more people you get, the larger your sample size is, the less context you'll have in the answer. So the type of feedback you get from surveys is useful in a specific context, right? And so if there are problems that a user faces and they have to explain something, or you have free, like, open-ended text that they input, once you have thousands and thousands of open-ended text to parse, on the developer side or on the designer side, it's going to be very hard to kind of make sense of it all. And so I think that's going to be the challenge, because I think users do want to tell like people in the community, like, I have problems with this feature, I'd like it improved in this way. And so it's very much, I think that's one of the challenges to kind of encouraging UX in the open source community is how do you kind of facilitate that one-on-one interaction, but in a way that's meaningful to both the user and the designer or developer, and that can scale. So there's just too many, like, you want something cheap, fast, and what is it? Cheap, fast, and
Cheap, fast, better.
better, right? It's kind of like, I feel like it's almost like that problem. I'm hopeful that there's a solution, but I haven't seen it yet. And
well, speaking of users, let's say I have a problem with UX, I want to report it in some way. Is there, let's say, I don't know, a checklist of what to report and in what way? Let's say, I don't know, I'm using Inkscape and I absolutely hate that there is no object manager, and I need to explain, what should I say? Should I say the reasons why I miss the object manager, or how would I like to use it? Is that a general template or something like that for reporting usability bugs, let's say?
I think that's a good point. So in Hyperkitty, I mean, as many projects do, there's this like way you can report bugs, and so I see some bug reports, and some are shorter, some are longer, and so the ones that are more lengthy, they do go into kind of, I'm filing this as a bug because I expected this scenario, and they go into depth and what they expected and why they expected it. And oftentimes, through that explanation, you can see kind of their mental model of things. Like, oftentimes it's a consistency problem. Like in version 1, it was this way, and now in this new version, it's not that way. And so some people are very good at, or are very good about writing that narrative. And for those who may not know how to write or may not know what they should cover in that narrative, I think it's a good suggestion. So maybe at least in our bug tracking, we should have templates and test it out. So I'd be curious to see how good people are at following templates, but it's worth a try, for sure. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just to comment on, they've gotten much better with commenting on kind of normal bugs, right? I mean, it makes a huge difference if you throw a template in to the quality of your bug reports.
Yeah, I think it's a good suggestion too. Yeah. So I would be curious to see how it works. So maybe I'll add that to my to-do list.
Question about communities. Do you know if the UX community is usually interested to participate in open source projects, and there's a lot of interaction between those two communities, or is it very divided? And what we can do to fix that, of course.
I think from an academic point of view, I thought it was interesting that there were a lot of papers up until like 2010, 2011, and then I haven't seen any papers in terms of usability aspects. Mm-hmm. There are open source papers in academia,
sure.
But not in terms of the usability side in the past couple of years. And so I'm not sure why that is, because it's not a solved problem. So, or maybe it's at a point where they don't know how to contribute or like make that contribution so that we can progress forward. I think it is a hard problem, but there are steps like the template that we can try to introduce to get us like baby steps toward that goal. So
would there be ways for us to address those, the UX communities and tell us, hey, we need this stuff?
I think it's a good thing to think about. I hadn't thought about going the other way, because now that I've kind of left academics, I kind of haven't thought about going back and soliciting, seeing what they can give to us. So, yes.
I have a thought actually on that. If you go back to the very first slide in your talk, or maybe the second one, you are not the user,
Oh, that one?
open-minded. It was like a list of things that we're actually bad at as the open source community sometimes,
Oh.
is what it struck me as.
It's not a short list.
Part of it is definitional because you are the user. That's part of the point. But in terms of
Is it this one?
if it's not, so maybe it wasn't the very first slide. Sorry.
This one?
Non-judgmental, open-minded,
Right.
you are not the user, yeah. So sometimes, I mean, there are talks elsewhere in the conference about how it's difficult to be a new user and a new element in the community. I think UX designers are still, you know, it's a relatively new thing for us to worry about, and we're not always as welcoming of people coming in with that perspective and telling
Yes,
us
so,
what to do.
yeah, there have been like a lot of Twitter activity I noticed, and this might just be in my own circle of people I know, but yeah, they were always saying that recently there have been, I guess people have written about contributions and valuing different types of contribution. That's traditionally, you know, if you don't write code, it's kind of not seen as a good contribution. And now that we have all these non-developer contributions, like whether it be documentation or UX or that kind of thing, it's to kind of realize that there are many ways to contribute to a product that are